Hello, Wayne Pop 2021 Virtual Edition. My name is Dr. Eric Wesselmann. I am a social psychologist in the Department of Psychology at Illinois State University, and today I will be talking to you about the psychological pleasure and pain of watching virus films during a global pandemic. So I'd like to begin with a story. Borders are sealed. Flights are grounded. People, wearing masks, are waiting in long lines for testing and experimental treatment. Nope, this is not a report from the nightly news. This is a description of the world in the 2021 film Little Fish. The film is set in the fall of 2021 amid a global pandemic. The viral threat is not COVID-19, however, but rather a neuroinflammatory infection called NIA. This virus can affect anyone with no clear patterns in transmission, progression, or clear directions for treatment. Essentially, it is a viral version of early-onset Alzheimer's disease. This film does not intentionally reflect our current global anxieties, still struggling through a pandemic ourselves, albeit one with different medical concerns. Little Fish was in production during 2019 and was supposed to premiere theatrically in 2020, delayed, of course, because of the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, it is difficult not to identify with the characters in their world. The scenes in which desperate individuals attempt invasive experimental self-surgery to cure themselves ring a little too close to home when we have people in the real world toying with the idea of injecting bleach and taking livestock medicine to treat COVID-19 symptoms. Further, the film depicts the all-too-common struggle of working through individual trauma embedded within a larger cultural trauma. Or as the character Emma says, "When your disaster is everyone's disaster, how do you grieve?" Films about viruses, pandemics, and the socio-cultural questions they evoke are certainly nothing new in the history of cinema. Films as far back as the 1922 version of Nosferatu, and then The Seventh Seal in 1957, invoke viral outbreaks as part of their plots, though sometimes tangential to the overall narrative. More recent films, however, such as Outbreak in 1995, Contagion in 2011, or 2016's Pandemic, and then of course Little Fish that I just talked about, have viruses and pandemics as their primary narrative focus. Interestingly, media research found an increase in watching virus and pandemic-related films during the early stages of the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic. Recently, the miniseries adaptation of Stephen King's The Stand, an apocalyptic narrative which is kickstarted by a viral outbreak that decimates the U.S. population, was premiered during the 2020 pandemic. Thus it seems that these narratives succeed in being entertaining in spite of, or perhaps even because of, the anxieties inherent in experiencing a global pandemic. Now, what may be some reasons why people would want to consume media that directly relates to the cultural anxieties in their daily lives, rather than something that would instead distract them from their stress? Could it be that certain psychological needs are satisfied by consuming this type of narrative? Not everyone watches this type of narrative, so there are certainly individual differences that would predict who watches and who does not. These are just some of the questions that I will be considering within this presentation. Further, I will provide exploratory data from audience research within the context of these questions. One way to approach these questions is to examine the theory and audience research surrounding the preferences for these films. Some scholars have approached understanding the attraction of specific films based on the genre in which they fit. However, pandemic films are difficult to classify in a traditional genre framework. Just focusing on the films that have a virus as a key plot point, we can see these films crossing a variety of genre labels. For example, IMDb.com classifies Outbreak as an action drama thriller, Contagion as a drama thriller, Pandemic as an action horror sci-fi, Little Fish as a drama, romance, sci-fi, and The Stand as an adventure, drama, fantasy. So out of all of these labels, we see that action, drama, and thriller probably come up the most commonly. There are other films that are typically labeled under the horror genre that have viruses at their center, such as 1973's The Crazies by director George Romero, and then the remake in 2010 by Breck Eisner, or Danny Boyle's 28 Days Later in 2002. Even traditional zombie narratives, such as George Romero's Living Dead series, or the Resident Evil film series, or Robert Kirkman's and AMC's The Walking Dead show, can be considered pandemic virus stories given that people become zombies because of a virus, or at least the process can be accelerated through blood or saliva contamination. Thus, I'm going to draw largely on horror-focused scholarship in this presentation. Even if the films themselves are not labeled traditional horror films, they certainly have elements that can be considered horrific. Most horror theorists agree that the aesthetic goals of these stories is to evoke specific emotional reactions in the audience, such as anxiety, discomfort, fear, revulsion, or disgust, and physiological responses normally associated with fight-or-flight survival situations, such as increased cardiovascular responses. Now, this previous work focuses on the affective components of watching these films, but other theorists have argued that films, or stories generally, regardless of their medium, can have cognitive and motivational effects on the audience as well. In the context of horror, many different folks have weighed in on the perceived functions that these narratives may serve. For example, from a horror creator's perspective, Stephen King has argued that fictional horrors help us cope with real-world horrors. Many other horror creators have made similar arguments. For example, David Cronenberg and Joe Dante, both two horror directors, have argued that this coping comes specifically from confronting and having some sense of control, at least the illusion of control, over fears about our own mortality specifically. Now, not only do these quotes have intuitive appeal, but they also converge with arguments that some horror film theorists and social scientists who study horror have made. For example, a book on interdisciplinary essays, editors Weaver and Tamburini echo King, Cronenberg, and Dante's arguments. Indeed, they go so far as to elevate these stories and call them cultural rituals. Additionally, and here are a few other examples of film theory books that take this cognitive, motivational approach on confrontation and mastery, focusing both on individual levels as well as cultural levels. Seldom is there only one reason for the existence and appreciation of any horror story genre. Here is a wonderful quote from scholar Andrew Tudor in the aptly titled essay, Why Horror? That illustrates the diversity of reasons why individuals might consume horror narratives. As you can see, I've highlighted the key terms for the ease of identification. We see titillation or high physiological arousal. Films as potential warnings or as a source of collective hilarity, right? Something that gets people to laugh, but most importantly, there's that collective note that it bonds people together. It's a social event. There may also be sort of this almost hipsterish mark of pride being associated with an undervalued culture, because horror as a genre is usually considered at the bottom of the metaphorical barrel. And then finally, this idea of being able to sustain an individual identity within a distinctive peer group. So you may be a group of horror fans, but some people may like vampire films, some people may like zombie films, so on and so forth. From another perspective, communications scholars have studied audiences of horror films. For example, Johnston conducted focus groups and quantitative survey research with self-identified horror fans. Collectively, Johnston identified 4 different motives among horror fans. I'm going to give you now those motives and some example face-valid items from those scales to illustrate. So, one of the more common categories that emerged was thrill watching. So, example would be someone who says, I like to be scared. Gore watching was another theme that came up and then emerged in a factor analysis. So, for example, someone endorsing the item, "I like to see blood and guts." We have independent watching. So this kind of resonates with this idea of confronting fears. So I watch because it makes me feel brave. And then problem watching, which was basically someone watching a film as a source of distraction, but not just because of general entertainment desires, but specifically to distract someone from real world problems they're experiencing. So we see a little bit of coping here, but it's almost like sort of a diversion type of coping. Of course, horror is a diverse genre, and horror fans do not always love every entry or subgenre within the broader framework of horror. Some folks may enjoy supernatural-focused stories and shy away from real-world horrors such as slasher films or films that fall within the torture porn category, such as Saw or Hostel. As such, it would be good to focus on specifically pandemic films when studying interest. So one researcher, Shriver, collected survey data during the early part of the pandemic, specifically focused on identifying potential individual differences that would predict those who enjoyed watching pandemic or virus-related films. And so Shriver hypothesized one key motive would be morbid curiosity, defined as an individual difference in intrinsic interest in information related to death. Now, morbid curiosity can be understood as a specific type of curiosity within the larger body of research on that domain. Curiosity in general can be thought of involving two aspects: liking to get new information and wanting to get new information. The first is generally considered a ubiquitously positive psychological state, whereas the later can be more negative because wanting suggests a motivational state focused on deprivation. So, getting the information in that context is satisfying a specific psychological need. Shriver had previously created an individual difference measure on morbid curiosity, and found that it predicted a variety of media interests, from horror to true crime. In this study, it predicted a person's likelihood of watching pandemic-related films, but also predicted their interest in learning vivid medical details about the symptoms and outcomes of COVID-19. Now, before I had learned about Shriver's data, I had noticed many people on my social network reporting an interest in watching pandemic-related films for the first few months of the pandemic. And I found this fascinating because I most definitely did not want to watch any of those films that people were mentioning. For example, Stephen King's The Stand is one of my favorite stories, but I have yet to watch the most recent adaptation because the concept of a supervirus killing large numbers of people is still a bit too close to home for me to find any enjoyment in the fictional story. I've known people who have died from COVID-19, and I know several long haulers. My children are still too young to be vaccinated under the current approval guidelines, and we are eagerly awaiting the time when they are eligible. Thus, I'm honestly not sure when I'll be ready to finally watch this adaptation of The Stand. There is an optimal level of fear that is enjoyable in fear-based entertainment, but for me at least, the potential realism of this narrative pushes it beyond that optimal level for me. There are lots of people who do not have that problem. I had a few hunches based on the horror film literature, as previously mentioned, why people might want to watch these films. But my hunches were not strong enough for me to generate specific hypotheses and choose relevant measures. As such, I simply threw the question out to my social media feed as an exploratory pilot study. I simply asked people if they are watching pandemic-related virus films or not, and what are the reasons for their specific decision. Now, I didn't do a systematic qualitative analysis. I kind of just eyeballed them, and here I've got some themes that I noticed coming up. First and foremost, some people the most said that they watched films that were specifically recommended by or from their own previous positive experiences watching those films growing up. Some people noted catharsis or perceived control over anxiety or fear. Still others argued from a curiosity perspective. Some people noted that they watched just to see if things were accurate. There were some folks on my social media feed who were in the medical profession, and they were just curious how accurate that the depictions were to what we know from scientific data. There were others who argued that the films were not likely to be accurate, and they were curious to see how off they were and to laugh at them. There were others, interestingly, who said that it was just topical entertainment. One of my favorite responses here was where someone said, "It's like watching a Christmas show at Christmas time. I would watch Outbreak, which, when I saw as a middle schooler, left an impression on me because I hadn't really developed a worldview yet, so I'd watch it for nostalgia, and because 'tis the season." That was one of my favorite references in that response. There were also folks who said that they wouldn't, and for some people they said it was just too real. One of my favorite quotes out of that was someone who said, "Watching one of these movies may be cathartic, but I think they would make my heart think that we're headed the way that my brain knows we're not." So we see a sort of emotional, rational conflict there. And then there were others who said they didn't want to watch it because it was unrealistic. So kind of the flip side of the curiosity seekers who wanted to see inaccuracy. To conclude, extant survey data and some of my pilot study responses suggest that morbid curiosity is one reason why individuals consume pandemic or virus-related films. Some other responses also correspond with broader horror film research, at least in terms of confronting one's fears. As such, future research on pandemic films should draw on audience motives for watching horror films as additional reasons for watching pandemic films. Finally, other responses from my pilot suggest that there are motives not accounted for either by morbid curiosity or what we know from extant horror theory. So researchers should consider systematic qualitative research methods to see what other themes may emerge. Thank you to the Wayne Pop crew for putting on this wonderful event. Thank you to my quote-unquote participants in my exploratory pilot study. Finally, thanks to all of you who are watching. Please stay safe during these times. Please get vaccinated if you can, wear your mask, and follow established health guidelines. I want to see you here again next year.